breathes on you its fetid, scorching breath, cannot kill the deep, immortal human wish, the timeless will. But for the storm that flung up barriers of wind and wave.
On 127 now. Sorry, I got cut off there.
Por the Principe in 2-3 days at most. But for the storm, we should have been prepared for what befell. Swift as the puma's leap it came. There was that interval of noiseless calm, filled only with the waters and the rigging's usual sound. Then sudden movement, blows and snarling cries, and they had fallen on us with machete and marlin spike. It was as though the very air, the night itself, were striking us. Exhausted by the rigors of the storm, we were no match for them. Our men went down before the murderous Africans. Our loyal Celestino ran from below with gun and lantern, and I saw, before the cane knife's blinding flash, Cinquez, that surly brute who calls himself a prince, directing, urging on the ghastly work. He hacked the poor mulatto down, and then he turned on me. The decks were slippery when daylight finally came. It sickens me to think of what I saw, of how these apes threw overboard the butchered bodies of our men, true Christians all, like so much jetsam. Enough, the rest is quickly told. Cinquez was forced to spare the two of us, you see, to steer the ship to Africa, and we, like phantoms, doomed to rove the sea, voyage east by day and west by night, deceiving them, hoping for rescue, prisoners on our own vessel, till at length we drifted to the shores of this your land, America, where we were freed from our unspeakable misery. Now we demand, good sirs, the extradition of Cinquez and his accomplices to La Habana. And it distresses us to know there are so many here who seem inclined to justify the mutiny of these blacks. We find it paradoxical indeed that you, whose wealth, whose tree of liberty, are rooted in the labor of your slaves, should suffer the august John Quincy Adams to speak with so much passion of the right of slaves to kill their lawful masters, and with his Roman rhetoric weave a hero's garland for Cinquez. I tell you that we are determined to return to Cuba with our slaves, and there see justice done. Cinquez, or let us say the prince, Cinquez shall die. The deep, immortal human wish, the timeless will. Cinquez is deathless primaveral image, life that transfigures many lives. Voyage through death to life upon these shores.
Beautiful poem. Again, apologize for getting cut off there. So many things to bring up about this poem. It has 3 parts, obviously, if you're following with it. The first essentially discusses sort of the, I don't know, almost normal run-of-the-mill horror that would occur in the Middle Passage. This sort of, sexual assaulting of the pretty women they had captured, the torture, the death by now malnutrition, by drowning, by madness, by dehydration, by disease of the different people who were stuck in steerage, stuck as basically cargo, sort of smashed together in these unbelievably brutal conditions. The middle part discusses, again, this sort of ugly fact of history that many Africans collaborated with Europeans in capturing people to be sold into slavery and profited from this in their turn. And then the final part of the poem discusses the Amistad Rebellion on board. The ship's called the Amistad, and they were off the coast of Cuba in the Indies when the rebellion took place, and there was they were eventually captured because the captains, as the poem describes, were were kept alive. They killed everyone else, but they kept the captains alive to steer the ship. They thought they were going back to Africa, but they were steering them in this zigzag until they found their way to the American coast in the Northeast. And this in the trial, the poem doesn't state clearly what happens, but in the trial, this guy Sinkez and the other slaves were acquitted and allowed to return to Africa. Although no one paid their way, no government would pay their way, they had to raise private charitable funds through abolition. This is in 1839, 1840, and it was a real galvanizing event, the trial, and then especially the verdict of not guilty, and that they were allowed to go free. That this became a big galvanizing moment for the abolitionist movement in America, for the cause of doing away with slavery altogether, which of course took another 20 years and a full-scale civil war for the institution of slavery to be abolished finally. Let's look at another poem now, just from later in Hayden's life. So Hayden kind of grew up he didn't want to be associated. He wanted to be a poet first and a black person second, essentially. He said he did not wish to deny that he was African American in his writing, but he didn't wish to make that all there was to his writing, or that was primarily what his writing was. And this is sort of the burden and the curse of all black writers, is like if you don't if you represent your people, you're not considered universal. If you aim for universality, you can be accused of not representing your people. And that's what happened to Hayden. In the 1960s, in the last 14, 15 years of his life, he dies in 1980, he was unwilling to kind of play nice and go along with the more radical youth in the poetic community who wanted poetry that was militant, that was political, that put black identity out there first and foremost. It was really poetry that was constantly in protest, okay? And Hayden had other values, but he also, of course, it was a heady time, and he saw things worth writing about in politics and history, so it was really a difference of degree and not of kind that I'm discussing. Let's just look at one last poem of his. This is on page 138, In the Morning Time. In the Morning Time. As the Gook woman house, this is about the Vietnam War. America was involved in Vietnam from 1945 to 1975 in a war there. First mainly the French attempt to recolonize Vietnam. This ends in 1954 in the assault on Dien Bien Phu and the defeat of the French, and then the Americans took over the war effort themselves, and most Americans probably think of the Vietnam War as occurring from basically like 1962, 1963 till we left in 1975. We were defeated, but horrible losses were suffered by the Vietnamese, and that's really what people protested so much, was the indiscriminate bombing, the ecocide, the use of chemical weapons like Agent Orange against the Vietnamese, and then of course nearly 60,000 U.S. service personnel, soldiers died in Vietnam. Most of those soldiers were drafted. The draft really affected poor people more than rich. If you could go to college, you were given a deferment. So it was basically our black and brown, our poor whites going to fight there. Why did the war end? Why did it end in defeat? Basically because the soldiers themselves rebelled against it. There's this myth about that war that it was hippies and rich college kids that ended the war. In fact, the soldiers on duty were mutinying. They were killing commanding officers in the field, so-called fragging. They were like hitting them with fragmentation grenades. They were sabotaging ships. They were going AWOL. They were deserting in huge numbers. And the soldiers themselves rebelled. And the adaptation the U.S. empire made was they ended the draft and they professionalized the military. So that nowadays soldiers are basically like, I have to be careful what I say here because it's such a sacred cow, but they are not drafted, they volunteer, and many of them take it as a career or take it as a way to better themselves, not as a matter of duty to the country so much. But that is also obviously a big part of the propaganda behind it. Okay. Any case, let's read this poem. In the morning time, as the gook woman howls. Gook was this racial epithet for, like calling someone the N-word for the Vietnamese. As the gook woman howls for her boy in the smoldering, as the expendable clean-cut boys from decent American homes are slashing off enemy ears for keepsakes. That did happen. They did take trophies, human trophies. As the victory flags are tallied up with flag-draped coffins, plastic body bags, what can my sorrow, anger, or pity say but this? We must not be frightened nor cajoled into accepting evil as deliverance from evil. We must go on struggling to be human through monsters of abstraction, though monsters of abstraction police and threaten us. Reclaim now renew the vision of a world where godliness is possible, and man is neither gook, nigger, honky, wop, nor kike, but man, permitted to be man. And you see his religiosity there, this godliness, but it's really about equality and no discrimination, no calling anyone by these names, right? Is neither, and then he says the whole list of them. I won't repeat it because there's some ugly words there, but in any case, it's sort of quaint to me. I appreciate the 60s poets a little bit, but this was his sense of fellowship, of universality of all mankind, the sort of species level thinking of just how connected we are and how much we need, as the middle passage poem says, freedom. Okay, so I'm coming back at you with a short lecture on Gwendolyn Brooks.